Hello and welcome to the Arab Digest podcast. My guest today is a Syrian analyst, Malik al-Abdeh, Managing Director of Conflict Mediation Solutions and Editor-in-Chief of the online magazine Syria in Transition. Malik, good to have you back at the podcast.
Always a pleasure, Bill.
On the 16th of April, the last U.S. troops departed Syria via Jordan. How significant, Malik, is their departure? And should we interpret it as a sign that Syria is moving towards stability?
First of all, the date of the US departure, I think, is interesting. 17th of April is what is known in Syria as Evacuation Day, and that was the day in which the last French soldier left Syria in 1946. And it's considered to be the equivalent of Independence Day. The fact that the last US soldier left on the 16th of April, a day before Evacuation Day, perhaps has some kind of symbolism that Syria is moving towards independence. Of course, Turkey still has forces in Syria, Russia still has bases there. And I think there will be pressure now on those two actors to perhaps also withdraw, given that part of the reason why they're there is to counter US influence in Syria. So now that US forces have left, I think there's going to be greater focus on Russian bases, but also on the fact that Turkey still maintains a military presence in much of northern Syria. Yes, it's an indication that perhaps the political leadership in Washington, perhaps not so much the military leadership, i.e. the Pentagon, but certainly the political leadership in Washington believes that the Syrian government is mature enough, is sophisticated enough, is capable enough of maintaining law and order, and most critically, combating ISIS, because that was the reason why the US forces were there in the first place. Now, can the Syrian government actually live up to that expectation? I think it's going to be difficult, and already there are a lot of anecdotal evidence emerging from places like Deir ez-Zor that ISIS activity is on the rise. So we'll see whether the Syrian government can actually clamp down on this and therefore vindicate the US decision to leave Syria. On the whole, though, I think most Syrians would welcome the withdrawal of US forces. I think the Kurds might be a bit nervous now because in the past, the thing that was stopping Turkey mainly of invading and attacking the Kurdish forces was the presence of US troops. Now that they're not there, I think it's now easier for Turkey to move against them, should Turkey wish to do that.
Yeah, well, that's what I wanted to ask you next, actually, was will Ankara see this withdrawal of U.S. troops as a good opportunity to further advance Turkey's interests and influence in the north of Syria?
I mean, Turkey has always wanted US forces to leave for precisely that reason, because as long as US forces were there, it's difficult for Turkey to crush the SDF. Now, of course, there's been an SDF Syrian government deal in late January on the integration of the SDF within the security forces, be it the Interior Ministry or the Ministry of Defense. That's to say the Syrian army. And there's been, noticeable implementation of that agreement. I mean, I think there are still a lot of outstanding issues, including the release of SDF prisoners. But there has been progress on that front, and there hasn't been any significant flare up of violence since that deal was struck. So, again, this is, the US withdrawal is probably an indication that this process is coming along nicely, that the US has faith in both sides, that they can make this work. Look, I mean, Turkey prefers not, I mean, at this stage, Turkey prefers not to intervene in Syria militarily again, as it did in the past. I think it has sufficient confidence in Damascus that Damascus will take on board its national security concerns. Turkey isn't entirely happy with the deal, the SDF integration deal, but for them, it's good enough. And the fact that US forces have withdrawn, conversely, will now put pressure on Turkey to also withdraw its forces. Turkey still maintains significant military presence, and a lot of Syrians now believe that presence is no longer warranted. There's no justification for it. And for Syria to fully to restore its sovereignty, the US has taken a positive step in that regard, and now that Turkey should also withdraw its forces. Will that happen? I think that's probably unlikely because Turkey wishes to maintain influence in Syria, not just through its own local proxies, who are now part of the Syrian army, also known as the Syrian National Army factions. I think it needs to maintain its forces to keep pressure on Damascus that if its interests are not taken into consideration, Turkey can actually step in militarily.
Yeah, that's interesting too, particularly in regards to Israel, because that's I want to put the same question to you about the Israelis, with the added proviso that the IDF is holding significant Syrian territory south of Damascus, including Mount Hermon. And when you combine that with the seizure of South Lebanon, you look on the map and you see this continuous strand of territory that the IDF is holding. It's part of this greater Israel strategy, which of course is a land grab achieved by military conquest. What are the odds now that the Israelis are going to push their advantage in the south, even as the Turks are perhaps being a little wary?
I mean, there's several theories of how to understand Israeli intentions with regards to these territories that they've advanced into. One school of thought says that actually Israel is essentially holding these territories to ransom in return for Damascus doing Israel's bidding in Lebanon. And I have it on good authority that actually Israel is indeed trying to pressure Damascus into intervening in Lebanon against Hezbollah, opening a new front against Hezbollah, in essence, disarming Hezbollah or playing a role in the disarmament of Hezbollah. Now, of course, Damascus is very reluctant to get involved in Lebanon. Turkey doesn't want Syria to get involved in Lebanon to fight Hezbollah. But Israel keeps pushing the issue, and there are people in the, let's say, the IDF establishment who believe that Israel should trade these territories, including Mount Hermon, in exchange for decisive Syrian intervention against Hezbollah, particularly in northern Lebanon, northern and eastern Lebanon. So these are areas that perhaps the IDF will never reach or doesn't is not able to operate in freely. The other school of thought is more maximalist in the sense that it believes that Israel actually wants to annex these territories long term and is not interested just in trading them for short-term military advantage. I mean, I tend to lean towards the second theory, which is that actually the people around Netanyahu wish to actually annex these territories and perhaps add them to territories that will be annexed from Lebanon, from southern Lebanon. And I think Israel has not really played its final hand yet in Syria. And Netanyahu and several extremist ministers within the Israeli government have indicated that after we get rid of the Shia, quote unquote, the Shia threat, there's a new Sunni threat emerging, the Sunni axis, Turkey, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and that they will, once they're done with Hezbollah and Iran, that they will also now need to deal with the Sunni axis. So again, this indicates that perhaps there's a long-term plan to annex these territories and to intervene in Syria more decisively, perhaps even moving against President Ahmed al-Sharaa. I mean, as long as the US, as long as the Trump administration and people like Tom Barak and others are protecting essentially the Syrian president, I don't think Israel can move decisively against him. But if there is a shift in Washington or a shift in focus, I think Israel does have ambitions, territorial ambitions in Syria. And many people around Netanyahu believe that there is now a golden opportunity. Syria has never been this weak in perhaps since its independence in 46, and they see it as a golden opportunity to create a greater Israel. Yeah, and I lean towards that view.
Very dangerous thinking, and do know that Netanyahu's theory of chaos, of really never-ending war, is one that, as you said, is backed by these very extremist ministers, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, of course. Uh, it's hard to see a happy ending to that scenario. and let us hope it doesn't come to pass. Um, since the fall of Assad, you have been able to return to Damascus several times. What do you notice about the mood of Syrians, and how has it changed from when you were first able to go back?
I think the overwhelming feeling that if you compare the feeling now to what it was in December 24, I would say in December 24, there was a sense of relief, overwhelming sense of relief, that a chapter has ended and potentially a more hopeful chapter is opening. There was also, I would say, also a sense of fear, but in a good way, a sense of fear by people within the state bureaucracy that these new rulers who are coming are upright, they are strict. So things like corruption and these old practices will no longer be tolerated. And indeed, I think in the first, let's say, 3 months, 2 to 3 months, there was a noticeable decline in people asking for bribes and just general corruption declined because out of fear of what the new rulers are going to be like. But also a more optimistic mood, people thinking, well, let's give them a chance. Surely things cannot be worse than they were under Bashar al-Assad. What I've noticed in my most recent visit to Syria, and that was in February, and I'm going there again end of this month, is that obviously that sense of optimism has dissipated. People are no longer afraid of the repercussions for things like corruption. A lot of the people from the old regime, let's say the bureaucrats of the old regime, have come to realize that HTS doesn't necessarily represent, quote unquote, the revolution, and that the revolutionaries, or let's say the people there who have long advocated a more democratic system in Syria, are not on the same page as HTS. So now they're seeing gaps and cracks within what they thought was a unified front. And people from the old regime also have been courted and embraced by the HTS authorities, which has upset a lot of people. Economically, of course, that's the dominating story in Syria. The fact that economically things don't seem to be moving in the right direction. Cost of living is through the roof. Even basic like goods, fruit and vegetables are more expensive than places like Lebanon or Jordan, which have a much higher average income. And so there's a feeling that the new authorities perhaps don't really know what they're doing in terms of governing a country as big and sophisticated as Syria compared to the one province, which is Idlib. And I think that optimism has given way to cynicism and to a great deal of perhaps anger at the new authorities. And actually, I mean, we're undertaking a public opinion survey as we speak, and that's already coming across from the results that I've seen. The satisfaction levels, whether people believe the country is moving in the right direction, those numbers have dropped dramatically just in the last 2 months. Because the cost of living now is really beginning to bite, coupled with the fact that reconstruction of infrastructure or housing hasn't really begun in any systematic way, apart from people doing it on their own dime. So the mood is getting darker. I think that's the best way to put it. There is a sort of a dark mood in Syria, and something needs to give. There needs to be either a huge cash injection, or there needs to be a move towards a more democratic system where people's anger and frustration is channeled through elected institutions. And right now we have neither.
Well, that brings me to my next question, Malik, which is the position of Ahmed al-Sharaa. How vulnerable is he, and whose interest do you see him serving right now?
I think quite apart from the the photo ops and let's say the online aura farming, Ahmed al-Sharaa came to power. We mustn't forget a basic fact. Ahmed al-Sharaa came to power. He was helped tremendously by actors and interests who saw him primarily as someone who can deny Syria to Iran, essentially. This is someone who, as soon as he swept into power, toppled Bashar, Iran was out of Syria. And as soon as Iran was out of Syria, there was a very deep, let's say, a deep gash to the axis of resistance project. And this is why Iran cannot supply Hezbollah effectively, why the whole axis of resistance project has become completely, has lost its balance because Syria was so pivotal. And as long as Iran remains a threat, or the return of Iran remains a threat, then there will be an interest by the likes of Saudi Arabia and Turkey, even to an extent Israel, in keeping him in power.
You're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and Malik al-Abdeh, editor-in-chief of Syria in Transition. For more on what Arab Digest has to offer, head to our website, arabdigest.org, where you can find details on how to subscribe to our daily newsletter. Sign up, and you'll receive the first 2 months for free. That's arabdigest.org.
I think the big threat that even insiders within HTS have voiced, privately of course, is that if the Iranian threat is no longer seen as existential, or perhaps there's even a regime change in Iran, I mean, as Israel has clearly aiming to do, and there is a more, let's say, pro-West regime in Iran, then what's Ahmed al-Sharaa's raison d'etre? I mean, why is he there? Given that, he might be a great guy for, all intents and purposes, but many of his people are not considered to be as nice in terms of some of their radical ideology, their attempts to impose very conservative Islamic traditions on society. So there's going to be a lot of questions asked if Iran is no longer a threat. And in my contacts with people within the government, it's very clear that the best case scenario for Ahmed al-Sharaa now is for Iran to remain a threat in order for him to justify remaining in power.
Interesting. Yeah, that is a very interesting thought. And you talked about the economic situation and the sense of gloom settling on the country. Uh, Presumably, people, are they starting to protest? Is there more repression of people expressing their points of view of demanding improvement in the economy? What's the situation there? Because as you said, this is a group, HTS, that was associated with Al Qaeda. They ruled Idlib with an iron fist. Now they're in control of the country. Are we seeing more repression?
I mean, repression, no, not anywhere near like the kind of repression that existed under Bashar al-Assad. I mean, partly because HTS has developed mechanisms of dealing with protests in a non-violent way. And we've seen this in Idlib when they were in control of that province. I mean, there were demonstrations every week against them for almost a year, from roughly August, September 2023, right up until they launched the military operation that toppled Bashar. There were demonstrations in Idlib on everything from calling for the release of detainees to bread and butter issues, cost of living, and so on. And what they've done is developed a sophisticated system whereby they appear to be protecting the demonstrations, at the same time trying to cut deals with protest organizers and local notables who are behind the protests in order to peel them away. And to an extent, they were successful in doing that in Idlib. Now, what has happened since? Yes, there have been demonstrations recently. I mean, I can count three that are significant. One is in Jobar. This was the demonstration by locals against an attempt by a developer to develop the local area, which was being completely destroyed during the war. They felt that the deal on the table didn't really offer them sufficient compensation. And I think that's quite an interesting development, especially in light of the much vaunted influx of foreign investors. They're clearly not giving the people a good deal. The other one was about the alcohol ban that came into effect last month. The governor of Damascus tried to, or did, ban alcohol in most places. There was a sit-in against that, which received a lot of publicity. More recently, on the 17th of April, to coincide with Evacuation Day, there was also I would say, a small protest, perhaps hundreds, in a square in Damascus to protest cost of living. It was contained, and there was some outbreaks of violence, mainly by supporters of the government against the demonstrators. But look, mass demonstrations of the kind that happened in 2011 are unlikely to happen in Syria for the time being. And perhaps the most important reason is that there is no organized opposition, and there is no organized opposition leaders who can actually lead the people, and who have, let's say, a critical mass of support that can get people to protest. The people who've called for this protest on the 17th of April, most of them are living outside of the country. Most of them are very secular, very liberal. And so most of the demonstrators that came out clearly came from middle class or upper middle class Damascene backgrounds. And those people aren't necessarily seen as an existential threat to this government. I think that the moment that protests start expanding to working class communities, I think that's when the government should be afraid. And so far, that hasn't happened. I mean, the government is using everything now to convince people that they have to be patient and not to demonstrate, including the religious card, by saying that, coming out against the legitimate ruler is un-Islamic, in a rhetoric that mirrors very much that of places like Saudi Arabia, for example.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned ISIS, and there are still, gather, other armed militias in the country. So to what extent does ISIS and other militias pose a threat to the stability and security of Syria?
The ISIS threat is growing, and it's growing because with cost of living and the lack of investment, lack of jobs, a lot of the, let's say, the frustration among Sunnis in particular, ISIS is benefiting from that frustration. And ISIS's message is very clear. We told you so. That's basically their message. We told you these guys are no good. Now you've seen it for yourself that they're no good. When we were in charge in places like Raqqa, we were very fair to everyone. Everyone had enough money to live on. We actually distributed money to poor families and so on. So ISIS is benefiting from this economic squeeze. And the problem is, for a lot of people, is that they don't even know that they're being, let's say, groomed by ISIS, or that they're joining an ISIS cell. Because, I mean, in terms of looks and message, it's hard to differentiate between an ISIS person and someone who's a radical within HTS.
Hmm.
Um, and so for like 18, 19, 20-year-old who's maybe unemployed, and he's maybe befriended some religious guys who are now, attending Quran circles and things like this. Before you know it, he's doing military training, and before you know it, he's part of some cell. Now, those people don't necessarily know at the beginning who they're dealing with, because ISIS does exist in Syria. I mean, it exists in Syria, not just in a clandestine fashion, but also you see them sometimes walking in the streets. They're there in places like Deir ez-Zor. They're not exactly hiding, but as long as they don't get involved in overt violence, the government is minded to, keep a close watch on them, but not necessarily to provoke them. I mean, that might be a pragmatic strategy, but I think it's a dangerous one in the long run, because the longer they're able to operate, let's say, in the religious sphere, they're likely to grow in numbers. And that's definitely something to watch.
And other militias, Malik?
In terms of the other groups, I mean, there are remnants of Iran-linked militias, but perhaps the most important one is Hezbollah still. Hezbollah has invested heavily in Syria, and they do have networks that still operate in Syria. I mean, the goal of these networks really right now is to facilitate weapons shipments to Lebanon via Syria. And I mean, there are allegations, and so far there have only been allegations, that people within the government, individuals within the government, have been paid off by Hezbollah to help facilitate the flow of arms. I mean, I haven't seen anyone being tried for this, but it's been widely rumored that that is the case. In terms of the threat, well, I mean, the most immediate threat is if Ahmed al-Sharaa is harmed by, either a Hezbollah-linked group or ISIS. And there have been very well-founded or well-sourced information that several attempts have been attempted on his life. The most recent one was December last year. And if Ahmed al-Sharaa is harmed, or if he's taken out of the picture, let's say, there's a very real risk that the country could descend into civil war, as different factions within HTS would then fight it out in order to replace him. And I think that would be very detrimental to the stability of the country.
Yeah, yes, it would indeed, given all that Syria has suffered in that terrible civil war. Well, yeah, thank you. Thank you for today's podcast. And certainly Syria requires a watching brief. And I know the good work you're doing, Malik, in that watching brief. So, yeah, keep it up. And we will be coming back to you soon, I have no doubt.
Thank you, Bill. Always a pleasure to be on Arab Digest.
My guest today on the Arab Digest podcast was Malik al-Abdeh, Managing Director of Conflict Mediation Solutions and Editor-in-Chief of the online magazine Syria in Transition. Arab Digest is an independent voice on the Middle East, North Africa. No sponsors, no advertising. Our support comes only from our subscribers. For more information on subscriptions, if you sign up, we're offering 2 months free. Head to our website, arabdigest.org. We have assembled a team of experts covering developments in the Middle East with analysis and commentary you will not find anywhere else. Follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn, and search our library of more than 300 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or other platforms. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest. Essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.